Supremacy and heavenly plurality. Isaiah in conversation with the divine council. An early Latter-day Saint thought. Isaiah's declarations that there is no God beside the Lord are frequently invoked in debates concerning Latter-day Saint teachings on exaltation and plurality of divine beings. This study asks whether Isaiah's rhetoric should be read as a denial of the existence of all other heavenly beings, or as a rejection of rival claims to ultimate sovereignty. By situating Isaiah within the broader scriptural witness, including Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32, Pauline language, Restoration scripture, and Nauvoo era sermons, the article argues that a model of exclusive supremacy combined with subordinate plurality better reflects both the ancient textual environment and early Latter-day Saint preaching. Introduction. Among passages cited in discussions of divine nature, Isaiah 45:5 is paramount. I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God beside me. Within post-creedal Christian theology, the verse often functions as a metaphysical absolute. Yet Isaiah belongs to a canon that also preserves scenes in which God presides among other beings designated as gods. The interpretive problem is therefore internal to Scripture before it becomes interreligious. This article does not attempt to settle theology. Its aim is historical and textual. What conceptual world do the sources appear to assume? I. The divine counsel in the Hebrew Bible. Psalm 82 prove it as one of the clearest examples. God standeth in the congregation of the mighty. He judgeth among the gods. Verse 6 continues, I have said, ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. Scholars debate the identity of these figures, human rulers, angels, or lesser divine beings. However, the psalm undeniably depicts plurality beneath the authority of the Most High. God remains judge. The others are accountable. This structure is hierarchical rather than competitive. 2. Deuteronomy 32:8 in textual witnesses. Deuteronomy 32:8 exists in multiple textual traditions. The Masoretic text reads Sons of Israel. Yet older witnesses, including fragments from Qumran and the Septuagint, attest a reading closer to Sons of God. If earlier, this implies a worldview in which A. Elion, the Most High, apportions nations, B. subordinate beings receive oversight, C. Yahweh Jehovah inherits Israel. The passage thus reflects differentiated divine administration without compromising ultimate supremacy. 3. Pauline usage. In 1 Corinthians 8:5-6, Paul acknowledges the language of plurality, as there be gods many, and lords many, but to us there is but one God, the Father. Here plurality is neither denied nor endorsed as an object of worship. Instead, allegiance is specified. IV. Restoration scripture. Doctrine and Covenants 121:28 anticipates disclosure concerning whether there be one God or many gods. The revelation leaves the matter open to future manifestation and does not reduce it to a philosophical formula. V. Nauvoo era developments. By the 1840s, Joseph Smith was publicly articulating doctrines of exaltation. In the King Follett Discourse, contemporary reports include the statement, "You have got to learn how to be gods yourselves." Historians widely recognize that Joseph Smith's late sermons expanded the scope of earlier Latter-day Saint cosmology toward explicit plurality and divine progression. 6. Brigham Young. Brigham Young declared, "There never was a time when there were not gods and worlds." His Adam Michael sermons intensified hierarchical language and later generated significant reinterpretation. Yet their presence in the historical record is secure. 7. Supremacy versus solitude. When Isaiah is read against these materials, a distinction emerges between exclusive supremacy, no rival, no equal, and absolute solitude, no other beings bearing divine designation. The former is demanded by Isaiah's polemic. The latter is not obviously required, particularly in light of Psalm 82. 8. Historical trajectory. Evidence suggests three phases. 1. Ancient Israelite texts preserving divine counsel motifs. 2. Early Christian negotiation of plurality with exclusive devotion. 3. Nauvoo era restoration preaching reopening expansive cosmology. Later Latter-day Saint discourse often de-emphasize some of these expressions, especially those vulnerable to misunderstanding in interfaith environments. Conclusion: Isaiah's assertions need not be read as a negation of heavenly plurality. Rather, they function as declarations of unrivaled authority. Such a reading permits continuity between the Hebrew Bible, certain early Christian formulations of participation in divine life, and early Restoration teachings on exaltation. The debate, therefore, is not whether supremacy exists, but how it relates to hierarchy. Common scholarly objections and possible responses. Regarding divine supremacy, council language, and early Latter-day Saint theology, this section summarizes major lines of criticism raised by historians, biblical scholars, and theologians. The goal is not to eliminate disagreement, but to clarify where the debates actually lie. Objection 1. Psalm 82 refers to human judges, not divine beings. Many interpreters argue that the gods in Psalm 82 are Israelite rulers who are metaphorically called divine, because they exercise judicial authority. Response: this interpretation has deep roots and cannot be dismissed lightly. However, several features complicate it. The setting is heavenly. The figures are called sons of the Most High. They are sentenced to die like men, implying they are not merely men already. Even scholars who favor the human judge reading acknowledge that the psalm draws upon older mythic or council imagery. The debate, therefore, is not between plurality and simplicity, but between different understandings of how inherited imagery is being reused. Objection 2. Deuteronomy 32' Sons of God is textually uncertain. Critics note that the Masoretic text reads Sons of Israel, and therefore caution against building theology on the Dead Sea Scroll or Septuagint reading. Response: the caution is fair. Yet textual criticism routinely weighs manuscript age, internal coherence, and contextual fit. Many specialists argue that Sons of God better explains the origin of the later reading. Even if uncertainty remains, the existence of such a tradition demonstrates that some ancient Israelites were comfortable imagining divine administration beneath the Most High. That fact alone is significant. Objection 3. Paul uses irony when saying God's many. Some argue that in 1 Corinthians 8 Paul is merely acknowledging pagan claims without granting any legitimacy to them. Response: that may be partly true. However, Paul still employs the vocabulary of plurality before defining Christian loyalty. He does not attempt a philosophical denial of all other heavenly beings. He establishes covenantal devotion. Thus, the passage is compatible with hierarchy even if it does not require it. Objection 4. Joseph Smith's late sermons are poorly transmitted. Historians frequently note that the King Follett Discourse and other Nauvoo sermons survive in fragmentary and second-hand reports. Response: absolutely correct. No responsible scholarship treats them as stenographic transcripts. Yet multiple independent accounts agree that Joseph publicly taught human exaltation and plurality. The general trajectory is secure even if precise wording is debated. Objection 5. Brigham Young's Adam sermons were later rejected. Yes. Later leaders distanced the church from Brigham's formulations. Response: but historical presence is different from modern acceptance. The fact that reinterpretation occurred proves that earlier leaders felt free to speculate in ways later generations preferred not to repeat. This is a development and emphasis, not an invention by critics. Objection 6. Isaiah's language is absolute. Many theologians argue Isaiah leaves no conceptual room for any other beings legitimately called divine. Response: this is possible. Yet if taken strictly, it produces friction with Psalm 82 and other passages. Therefore interpreters must either 1. Explain those passages metaphorically, or 2. Read Isaiah as excluding rivals rather than all subordinate beings. Both are interpretive moves. Neither is automatic. Objection 7. Later Latter-day Saints emphasize simplicity for good reason. Some argue theological restraint prevents misunderstanding. Response: that may be pastorally wise. However, historical investigation asks what was said, not what later proved easier to teach. Concluding observation: the debate is often portrayed as a conflict between faith and error. In reality, it is largely a dispute about genre, metaphor, textual history, theological development, and changing public vocabulary. Once framed this way, the conversation becomes more precise and less polemical. Later Latter-day Saint reframing of Nauvoo era divine language. Introduction. Teachings articulated in the Nauvoo period concerning divine plurality, exaltation, and hierarchical heavenly orders did not disappear after the deaths of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. However, the vocabulary, emphasis, and interpretive boundaries surrounding those teachings changed significantly over time. This section traces how subsequent leaders and institutional publications preserved, qualified, softened, or rejected earlier formulations. Immediate post-Nauvoo continuity. In the late 19th century, sermons printed in the Journal of Discourses frequently repeated expansive cosmological themes: eternal progression, plurality of gods, humanity advancing toward divine inheritance. Public discomfort with such language was relatively limited within the Intermountain West. However, even in this era, leaders did not present every speculative statement as binding doctrine. A spectrum of confidence existed. 2. Early 20th century correlation of language. By the early 1900s, the Church increasingly engaged the broader American Christian environment. As interfaith dialogue intensified, certain expressions that sounded overtly polytheistic became liabilities in public explanation. Leaders began emphasizing unity of the Godhead worship directed to the Father, the uniqueness of divine authority, without necessarily denying earlier cosmological teachings. The shift was rhetorical before it was theological. 3. The case of Adam Michael. Statements from the 19th century associating Adam with divine fatherhood became particularly controversial. By the early 20th century, church authorities clarified that such sermons should not be treated as official doctrine binding upon the saints. This did not erase the historical record. It placed interpretive distance between pulpit speculation and canon. IV. Mid-century pedagogical simplification. Curriculum materials, missionary discussions, and public statements increasingly preferred concise affirmations such as, "We worship one God. The Father is supreme." Complex cosmological hierarchies receded from ordinary teaching contexts. Scholars often describe this as a move from theological exploration toward institutional standardization. V. Persistence beneath the surface. Despite simplification, older ideas never vanished entirely. Concepts such as eternal progression, becoming heirs of God, participation in divine life, remained embedded in temple liturgy, hymnody, and scriptural interpretation. Thus, the tradition retained expansive potential even when public rhetoric narrowed. 6. Modern academic re-engagement. In recent decades, Latter-day Saint scholars have revisited early sources with renewed historical interest. Rather than suppressing Nauvoo theology, many now seek to contextualize it within ancient Near Eastern divine council patterns, Second Temple Judaism, early Christian theosis traditions. This approach tends to normalize Joseph Smith's language by locating analogs in antiquity. 7. What changed, and what did not? What changed? Willingness to speak in bold cosmological terms, public comfort with plurality language, the boundary between speculation and doctrine. What did not change? Affirmation of the Father's supremacy, belief in exaltation, the expectation of eternal inheritance. Conclusion. Reception history demonstrates that the issue was not invention versus absence, but management of inheritance. Later leaders inherited a theological vocabulary that was powerful, expansive, and sometimes difficult to explain in broader Christian settings. Their responses range from reinterpretation to selective silence. Understanding this process helps modern readers avoid projecting present categories backward onto 19th century sermons. Primary documents illustrating doctrinal reframing, from Nauvoo speculation to 20th century boundary setting. Introduction. Theological vocabulary in early Latter-day Saint discourse was often expansive, exploratory, and cosmological. Over time, church leaders increasingly distinguish between speculative sermon language and binding doctrine. This section presents representative documents frequently cited by historians to illustrate that transition. The goal is descriptive, not polemical. Nauvoo Expansive Plurality and Exaltation. Joseph Smith, April 7, 1844, King Follett Discourse. You have got to learn how to be gods yourselves the same as all gods have done before you. Multiple contemporaneous reports preserve this teaching. While wording varies, scholars agree Joseph was publicly advancing a theology of divine plurality and human exaltation. Brigham Young, October 1852. When our father Adam came into the Garden of Eden, he came into it with a celestial body. He is our Father and our God. Later generations would debate interpretation, but the sermon demonstrates the degree of theological boldness present in the 19th century. 2. Late 19th century confidence but growing sensitivity. Plurality and progression continued in sermons, yet leaders increasingly reminded listeners that not every statement from the pulpit constituted binding revelation. The distinction between authoritative doctrine and inspired opinion began receiving more attention. 3. Early 20th century formal clarification. Joseph F. Smith, The Father and the Son. This first presidency statement standardized terminology concerning the Godhead and clarified how scriptural divine titles should be understood. It did not attempt to canonize 19th century speculation. Instead, it defined safe interpretive ground for the Church. Historians often view this as a key moment in theological consolidation. IV. Mid-century drawing brighter lines. Spencer W. Kimball. In General Conference, President Kimball referred to the Adam God teaching as a theory and indicated it was not accepted as doctrine by the Church. Here we see institutional willingness to name earlier ideas while declining to perpetuate them. V. Late 20th century correlation and catechesis. Teaching materials, missionary discussions, and manuals consistently emphasized one God the Father, unity of the Godhead, worship directed upward, without elaborating 19th century cosmological speculation. The practical result was a narrowing of everyday vocabulary. 6. What these documents show. They show neither denial nor simple continuation. They show management. They show leaders inheriting powerful but complicated sermons and deciding how prominently those sermons should function in global teaching. 7. Why this matters for historical reading. Modern readers sometimes assume earlier statements must match present usage. Reception history demonstrates otherwise. Traditions develop. Language stabilizes. Boundaries move. Yet the archival record preserves earlier voices. Conclusion. The transition from Nauvoo exuberance to correlated restraint is not hidden. It is traceable in official publications, conference addresses, and first presidency statements. The question is not whether change occurred. It is how to interpret it. Citation patterns in the curation of memory, who continued to be quoted, who faded, and how traditions stabilize. Introduction. Religious communities do not preserve every past statement with equal intensity. Over time, certain voices are amplified while others recede. This process, often unconscious and usually practical, is central to how traditions maintain coherence across generations. Latter-day Saint history provides a particularly clear case, because 19th century sermons were expansive, speculative, and frequently improvised, while 20th century instruction increasingly favored standardized clarity. From pulpit culture to curriculum culture. In the 19th century, preaching was event-based. Apostles and presidents spoke extemporaneously, often exploring ideas in real time. The result was theological richness alongside ambiguity. In the 20th century, correlated curriculum shifted authority toward approved manuals, missionary discussions, repeated core formulations. What could be easily summarized tended to survive. What required extensive context tended to diminish. 2. The gradual narrowing of quotable material. Early leaders quoted Joseph Smith frequently, but often selectively. For example, statements about priesthood, temple ordinances, or prophetic calling remained central. By contrast, material from the King Follett discourse concerning plurality of gods or divine genealogy appeared less often in mainstream instructional settings. The change is measurable in lesson manuals and conference usage. 3. The case of Brigham Young. Brigham Young continued to be revered as a prophetic successor, colonizer, and organizer. However, later generations cited him far more often for pioneer faith, obedience, temple work, settlement of the West, and far less often for speculative cosmology. The man remained. Certain emphases faded. IV. Silence is not erasure. It is important to note that reduced citation does not necessarily mean suppression. Often it reflects pedagogical practicality, missionary sensitivity, global audience concerns, desire for doctrinal stability. In worldwide religions, simplification is common. V. How institutional memory works. Historians of religion note several recurring mechanisms. 1. Compression. Complex teachings become short formulas. 2. Standardization. Ambiguous expressions are clarified. 3. Prioritization. Some themes become central, others peripheral. 4. Boundary maintenance. Risky language is contextualized or avoided. These processes are observable across Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, and Islam as well. Latter-day Saints are not unique in experiencing them. 6. The result. By the mid-20th century, many ordinary members encountered a version of their history that emphasized unity of the Godhead more than cosmic plurality. Meanwhile, the earlier sermons remained available in archives, specialized studies, and independent publications. 2 layers of memory operated simultaneously: public teaching and historical record. 7. Modern re-engagement. Recent scholarship, aided by documentary projects and digitization, has made early sermons more accessible. As a result, conversations once limited to specialists now appear in broader discussion. This can feel like rediscovery, even when the material was never lost. Conclusion. The movement from exuberant plurality toward cautious clarity is not best described as betrayal or invention. It is a recognizable example of how living traditions adapt inherited language for new circumstances. Understanding this helps prevent anachronism when reading either 19th century sermons or modern manuals. How fundamentalist critics and institutional responses often differ. Competing explanations about Adam, God, and historical memory. Introduction. Within Mormon history, disagreements about 19th century sermons, particularly those of Brigham Young, have produced sharply different narratives. Fundamentalist groups and institutional representatives often begin from the same documents, but interpret what happened afterward in very different ways. Below is a fair presentation of how each side commonly frames the issue. What fundamentalist critics might say. A fundamentalist-leaning interpretation often sounds something like this. 1. Brigham Young publicly taught Adam God. The sermon was delivered in conference settings and printed in the Journal of Discourses. Therefore, they argue, it carried authoritative weight for the saints who heard it. 2. Later leaders distanced themselves from the teaching. When 20th century presidents such as Spencer W. Kimball denounced the Adam God theory, fundamentalists see this not merely as clarification but as reversal. 3. Members gradually stopped hearing these teachings. Because the material was no longer quoted in manuals or conference, many ordinary saints grew up unaware it had ever been preached. 4. Therefore, institutional memory changed. From this perspective, the absence of frequent citation can feel like quiet removal. A stronger version sometimes heard. Some fundamentalist writers go further and suggest intentional efforts were made to minimize access to earlier materials, or to reinterpret them so they would not disrupt modern instruction. This is where claims sometimes arise about editorial changes, altered editions, or discouragement of certain readings. How institutional historians usually respond. Mainstream LDS historians and leaders tend to reply differently. They usually argue 1. Yes, Brigham said it. The sermon exists, is printed, and is studied. 2. But sermons are not canon. Authority in the church ultimately rests in the standard works and united prophetic declaration, not in every historical address. 3. Leaders can clarify or correct earlier speculation. President Kimball's rejection is seen as an example of living prophetic authority defining boundaries. 4. Reduced emphasis is not erasure. Materials remained in libraries, archives, and later digital collections. Scholars continued to discuss them openly. The question of changing editions. One recurring claim in fundamentalist circles is that leaders such as Heber J. Grant altered or republished materials in ways that prevented members from seeing earlier teachings as originally presented. Institutional historians generally respond that multiple printings and pagination differences are normal in publishing history. Typographical modernization is common. No credible documentary evidence shows a coordinated program to hide sermons. Original editions remained accessible in research libraries. In other words, they argue variation is bibliographic, not conspiratorial. Why the two sides talk past each other? Fundamentalists often focus on continuity, what early leaders taught. Institutions focus on authority to define doctrine now. So one side asks, why did we stop teaching what they said? The other asks, who has the right to determine binding doctrine today? Different starting points lead to different conclusions. What almost everyone agrees on. Both sides generally accept that the sermons were preached later. Leaders rejected their doctrinal status. Ordinary members today are less familiar with them. The disagreement concerns interpretation of that trajectory. Conclusion. Understanding how each side frames the story helps explain why conversations can become heated. Participants are often operating with different assumptions about authority, memory, and prophetic succession. Clarifying those assumptions is usually more productive than trading accusations. Evaluating fundamentalist arguments about prophetic infallibility and Adam God, where the case is strongest, where it is weakest, and why disagreement persists. Introduction. Disputes over 19th century teachings, particularly those associated with Brigham Young, often hinge less on the sermons themselves and more on what prophetic authority is supposed to guarantee. The key statement frequently cited comes from Wilford Woodruff, who taught that the Lord would not permit the president of the church to lead the saints astray. From that premise, different conclusions follow depending on how one defines lead astray, doctrine, prophetic responsibility, and the difference between sermon and revelation. The strongest form of the fundamentalist argument, when presented in its most coherent shape, it usually runs like this: 1. Presidents of the church promised they could not lead the saints into error. Therefore, sustained public teaching from the pulpit carries enormous weight. 2. Brigham Young, as president, taught Adam God repeatedly and confidently over many years. 3. These teachings were not private musings. They were delivered in conference settings and printed for the membership. 4. If modern leaders now say the doctrine is false, then one of two conclusions seems unavoidable. Either Brigham Young led the church astray, or current leaders are doing so. 5. In either case, the promise of protection from error appears threatened. This is powerful because it appeals to trust in prophetic reliability. Why this argument persuades many people? It feels straightforward. It avoids complicated textual debates. It relies on loyalty to prophetic assurance. For members raised on confidence in divine guidance, it can be emotionally compelling. Where institutional defenders push back, mainstream LDS responses usually challenge the assumptions, not the history. They argue, 1. Lead astray does not mean never express incorrect ideas. Prophets in Scripture can err without destroying the church. Protection is seen as applying to the church's saving mission, not to every sermon detail. 2. Not every presidential statement is binding doctrine. Institutional theology distinguishes between canon official declarations, United First Presidency statements versus individual preaching. Therefore, a president can speculate without committing the church. 3. Later prophetic clarification is part of the system. Living authority includes the right to define limits on past speculation. From this view, correction is not failure, it is governance. Where critics see weakness, fundamentalists commonly reply, if members at the time reasonably believed they were hearing doctrine, then the practical effect was the same as official teaching. Thus, redefining categories later can feel retroactive. Where the fundamentalist case is most vulnerable, historians often note difficulties here. Problem 1. Leaders did disagree with one another in the 19th century. So uniform certainty is hard to demonstrate. Problem 2. No formal canonization occurred. Adam God never entered the standard works. Problem 3. Later rejection was public and explicit. So concealment is difficult to prove. The core issue beneath everything, it comes down to this question: does prophetic protection guarantee correctness in teaching, or preservation of the church's ultimate destiny? Different answers produce radically different interpretations of the same events. Why conversations stall? Each side begins with a different model of authority. Fundamentalists emphasize continuity of teaching. Institutions emphasize continuity of keys. Unless that difference is acknowledged, participants often talk past each other. A careful summary: it is historically demonstrable that Brigham Young taught Adam God. Later presidents rejected it as doctrine. Members must decide how prophetic fallibility operates. What cannot be demonstrated is that one interpretive model is inevitable. Reading the documents for myself, why the statements on Adam, keys, and divine hierarchy keep me thinking, I am not writing this as a representative of any organization. I am not trying to win a side. I am simply a reader who has opened the documents and discovered that the history is more complicated, more beautiful, and sometimes more uncomfortable than the summaries I grew up with. So I want to lay out, in plain terms, what I see. Joseph Smith changed how I read everything. When I read Joseph Smith's April 7, 1844 sermon, I cannot escape how large his theology is. He said, "Here then is eternal life, to know the only wise and true God." You have got to learn how to be gods yourselves. To be kings and priests to God, the same as all gods have done. By going from a small degree to another, from grace to grace, from exaltation to exaltation, times and seasons. The 15th of August 1844, reporting the April Conference Discourse. Whatever else someone thinks, Joseph is describing ascent, order, and precedent. Others have done this before. So heaven is not empty. It is structured. Then I read Joseph's statements about Adam. In Nauvoo era teaching notes, Joseph said of Adam, "Adam is Michael, the Ancient of Days, to whom Christ was first revealed, and through whom Christ has been revealed from heaven and will continue to be revealed." When I read that, I see a channel of authority. Christ's right arrow revealed to Adam, right arrow revealed through Adam. That is government language. Joseph also said Adam holds keys, in teachings later repeated in church manuals. Joseph described Adam as holding the keys of the dispensation and eventually delivering stewardship up to Christ. So Adam is not merely symbolic. He presides. He gathers. He stands in counsel. At that point, I naturally ask, if Joseph opened plurality of gods, and Joseph placed Adam at the head of the race, and Joseph described revelation moving through Adam, what did his successors think that meant? Then I read Brigham Young, and Brigham speaks with startling directness. In 1852 he declared, "When our father Adam came into the Garden of Eden, he came into it with a celestial body. He is our Father and our God, and the only God with whom we have to do." Journal of Discourses, Volume 1. I cannot pretend he did not say it. It is printed. It was preached. Saints heard it. And here is where my struggle begins, because later presidents, for example Spencer W. Kimball, explicitly rejected the Adam-God doctrine and warned members not to teach it. So I am left holding two realities at once. Brigham said it. Later leaders said do not teach it. The question I cannot escape, what does prophetic protection mean? Wilford Woodruff promised the Lord would not permit the president to lead the saints astray. I believe he meant it. But how does that promise function if presidents can later correct presidents? Does astray mean loss of salvation? Or does it mean something else? I noticed something else. The early saints lived in a preaching culture. Bold ideas were explored publicly. The 20th century built a curriculum culture. Clear, repeatable formulas became necessary for a global church. I can understand why simplification would happen. But simplification can also feel like distance. What I am not willing to do, I am not willing to say Brigham never taught it. He did. I am not willing to say later leaders secretly erased it. The sermons remained in print. And I am not willing to pretend Joseph's theology was small. It was enormous. Where I land, personally, I find myself wondering whether Brigham believed he was explaining Joseph. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe he was right. Maybe the truth is more layered than either option. But the documents show me that the conversation is real. Why I keep reading? Because the moment I stop pretending the past was simple, the restoration becomes more alive, not less. Real people. Real wrestling. Real attempts to understand heaven. I am still working it out. But I think pretending the tension doesn't exist helps no one. Can we talk about Adam without leaving the room? A personal attempt to hold Joseph, Brigham, and modern saints together. I want to try something risky. I want to talk about Adam. But I want to do it in a way where nobody feels like they have to storm out, defend a position, or protect the tribe. I am not trying to win. I am trying to understand. Where I begin with Joseph Smith. When Joseph preached in Nauvoo, his universe was huge. He said, "You have got to learn how to be gods yourselves." Whatever else we do with that sentence, it opens doors. It tells me heaven is not a flat place. It is ordered, alive, relational. There are beings ahead of us. There is movement. There is inheritance. Then Joseph starts talking about Adam. Adam is Michael. Adam is Ancient of Days. Adam holds keys. Christ is revealed through Adam. Adam gathers his posterity. That sounds like administration, government, family order. So when I read Joseph, I do not see a lonely sky. I see structure. And then I read Brigham Young, and Brigham says, Very directly, Adam is our father and our God. Now I know that sentence is explosive today, but I also know it is historical. So I have a choice. I can either pretend he never said it, or I can ask why a prophet I sustain believed he could say it. Here's what I notice. Brigham did not preach it like a rebel. He preached it like a man extending what he believed Joseph had already opened. He thought he was staying inside the restoration. And then history keeps moving. Later leaders step in and say, "We are not teaching that." And I understand why. The church is worldwide. Language matters. Misunderstanding multiplies fast. I can see the pastoral need for clarity. But I do not want clarity to erase memory. I want to be able to admit, Brigham said it. Later leaders rejected it. Members feel tension about it. All three can be true at once. Here's the deeper question for me. If Joseph opened a world where humans become divine, and if Adam stands at the head of the race, is it shocking that some early saints wondered how far upward that identity might reach? It seems almost inevitable someone would ask. Instead of panic, what if we ask better questions? What did Brigham think he was protecting? What did later leaders think they were protecting? What risks did each see? Because everyone involved believed they were defending the work of God. Maybe this is not betrayal. Maybe it is inheritance under pressure. How do you keep a vast, cosmic theology and still teach primary children and still talk to Methodists and still hold a global church together? That is not easy. What I hope we can do. I hope we can read Joseph and let him be big. I hope we can read Brigham and let him be bold. I hope we can read modern prophets and let them set boundaries for today. And I hope we can admit the story is complex without accusing each other of dishonesty. Because here is what I fear: if we only allow tidy history, people will eventually discover it wasn't tidy. And then trust breaks harder than it needed to. What I believe the restoration is strong enough to survive its own records. Maybe even stronger because of them. I am not asking you to agree with my conclusions. I am asking if we can stay in the conversation. Because once we leave the room, learning usually stops.